So this afternoon's session, session 2, is all about the early successes of the Benthic imagery action plan. We're going to have 3 speakers. My name is Joe O'Connor. I'll be facilitating the session, this 2-hour session. As before, please raise your hand or use the chat during the talks if you want to raise any points. After each of the talks, we will have time for any questions, and then after that, depending on how long the talks run for, hopefully we'll have ample opportunity to have a kind of a wider group discussion. What I'll do now is introduce our first speaker, the lesser spotted Henk van Rein. Henk is a marine ecologist who works for Joint Nature Conservation Committee, where he's designed, conducted, and analysed data from benthic monitoring surveys in offshore marine protected areas for 5 years. And Henk will be talking to us about the work he's been involved in developing standard benthic imagery purposes. So I'll hand you back over to Henk without any further ado.
Thank you, Joey. I'll be a bit more scene setting for some of our early successes with the big picture group collaboration. First of all, there's a question here. What do we use seabed imagery for? It seems a very simple question, but actually there's a fair bit of work there to sort of drill down and find out what sort of purposes, what are the purposes behind the uses of seabed imagery. So why is this a problem? Well, seabed imagery is collected every day across the UK. Well, it's collected everywhere, really. The differences in survey targets, design, sampling platform, processing, and the products. Some of this information is archived and can be shared with others. The appropriate use of shared data requires knowledge, really, of why that information was collected, where it was collected, how it happened, and what was done to it. And this is sort of one of the reasons why we set up standards, is to facilitate the sharing process. Now, this why, where, how, and what are not known for the majority of seabed imagery. The consequence of that is that all imagery cannot be shared. There are other more complex reasons why they can't be shared as well, to do with sort of rights and permissions and contracts and so on. But ultimately, not having the standards by which they can be shared is a fundamental reason. This results in sort of additional survey effort being required to sort of collect information, sometimes from the same areas, but by different organizations, and additional analysis effort is needed. And ultimately there's a potential for poor imagery quality if you haven't got any standards. So let's go back 2 years ago to the big picture workshop in 2019. We discussed this thing. In fact, this table you see in front of you, at that exact moment, they are discussing purposes, benthic imagery purposes. And so what do we need to sort of get standard purposes? What are our purposes? Where does this all go? Their information and others' information was put together. This is an example of the benthic imagery action plan from earlier again. If I blow up the middle section, this is all to do with, these are tasks to do with overarching guidelines and the development of overarching guidelines and standard purposes for imagery. Now, looking at these, we initially selected these 4 purposes, these 4 tasks, as they seem to be the most sort of immediate pressing tasks that would enable the development of something wider, some sort of a framework for standards when using benthic imagery. And also looking at these 4 tasks, if we worked in these 4 tasks, there'd be a spillover effect across many of the other areas in the imagery action plan. So it was deemed worth it. And so this is a bit more information about the actual tasks themselves. I don't really want us to read through the text, but just I guess I'm signposting that these tasks, they all came out of the Benthic imagery action plan. You know, it's not stuff we made up. We're sort of going with what was identified by the group as being an issue. So the first bit is to identify and define a range of purposes for using Benthic imagery, and then come up with sort of standard requirements for those purposes. Then to try and develop some minimum data standards for those imagery purposes. And then finally, can you come up with sort of minimum standards for data quality and apply those within your organization? Can you apply them to contracted analyses, including time and budget estimates? So we kicked off this project then, the Benthic Imagery Purposes Project. And the aim was to develop guidance on the minimum requirements for a range of different uses of Benthic imagery in the UK. And then secondly, to use this guidance to underpin the development of future imagery standards. And some of our other speakers later on in the session will talk a little bit more about that. The first stage of this whole process was to consult with members of the Big Picture group about why they use imagery, what they use it for. So we put together a questionnaire. Many of you on the call will have participated in this questionnaire. There were 28 mixed structure questions, and we sent it out to 100 people across 39 organizations at the time. What sort of questions are there? Well, there were questions on sort of what sort of purposes could people use imagery for. We fleshed out a few of those. There were questions on, kind of training, what sort of training methods and approaches do people use. There were questions on actual acquisition, sampling equipment that people use, stills, video, imagery resolution, how frequently do they collect imagery, what do they target with imagery? Do they want to sample everything, or are they just looking for specific things? What design do they use? What's counted? What software do you use? Then, do you already use any standards or not? Do you have any quality assurance measures? And then more general things like, do you share the information afterwards? Can you share the information? What's generated? What are your operational costs for this whole pipeline? We put all that information together and parked that, and then we followed up with a number of organizations through one-to-one interviews online. And again, many of you also participated in those. There were 1-hour interviews that drilled into a lot of the information asked on the questionnaires, but with more specifics on the actual sampling equipment and apparatus that people used, on their bespoke operational procedures. Very, very interesting. Sort of hearing from you all about how you collect and use imagery, and this was all carried out by Jess Taylor, who's on the call, and James Albrecht, who is not able to join us because he's on survey at the moment. So thanks again, Jess and James, for your hard work on this. I'm going to show you just a few of the responses to give you a flavor of some of the things. I know you're probably interested in the results. First off, these are sort of votes on the number of purposes that people were interested in, and we see straight off that mapping is sort of the number one, the most common approaches in the group of people that we asked. Most common purposes that people use imagery for are for mapping seabed habitats. Next up, so testing novel technologies and techniques. This is more, this is basically scientific research. This is sort of any application of sort of going out there and trying out new things. We see those purposes coupled with monitoring, detecting change in seabed conservation features. Those are our sort of next common set of purposes. Next up, looking at what sort of things do people target? Well, habitats occupy a good portion of that. Conservation features occupy a good portion, and specific species. Those were probably the most common groups. There's also, I suppose it's almost equal there for sediments and communities. Okay, no real surprises there. Most of the participants in that just do one-off collection. So it's just collected for bespoke purposes, and that's it. The vast majority, little bit of repeat monitoring and other types of monitoring, but it's mostly sort of one-off collection, perhaps a bespoke survey. Well, how is it being collected? Well, divers collect a good bit, you see. But when you group ROVs, they aren't grouped very well in this graph. They're grouped by proportions, but ROVs feature 3 times here in the top bit. So we do have a fair bit of the group using remotely operated vehicles. Also, a fair bit of the group using drop-down cameras. Sort of a range of hand-deployed, off-bottom towed systems and on-bottom towed systems. Even autonomous underwater vehicles featured a little bit in this. In terms of design, most of the information is collected at locations already known. A lot of it's haphazard. In many cases, there's also no standard approach. What's recorded? Mostly presence absence and a quantification scale called SAC4, semi-quantitative scale. So mostly those data are recorded, and then sort of counts and percent cover. We also have, so the last thing I want to show you about this is the standards. What sort of standards do people have and use? The vast majority just use their own standards, their own processes, their own QA. And in other cases, they use MEDAN guidance and standards. So it shows you this is where we'd like to sort of work on coming up with some sort of standards framework, but the other speakers will talk about that. So we took these results, and this is an example of what they look like, sort of lots and lots and lots of entries, and we crunched them. We even ran some non-parametric tests through them, generating Bray-Curtis similarity matrices. This is an example of one, grouping the different purposes that were in the survey with the range of values that were, like the range of values that were supplied, and we were able to form clusters, and from that we selected a range of these clusters and started to flesh those out a little bit more into some sort of standardized purpose that would have a range of minimum recommended attributes that you would have to do or perform in order to meet that standard purpose. And we came up with 6 of these in the end. 6 core purposes. Marine archaeology and heritage was one. Fishery stock assessment was another. Identification, training, and public outreach. So sort of general imagery used for those purposes is another. R&D, research and development. And then sort of 2 ones where the full seabed was being characterized in the imagery, but one is for sort of habitat, biodiversity assessment processes. And another was more for sort of assessment of human activity associations. And then in each one of these purposes, there were there were recommended standards for acquisition of imagery, the features identified in the imagery, additional data collected, and data management and output quality assurance. We also produced a flow chart. This is just an example, just to sort of help people, guide people to their purposes. Job done? Afraid no. We sent the purposes out to review back to members of the big picture group and found that they were lacking. They weren't quite right. So we left the decisions that we made. We left the marine archaeology purposes to the marine archaeologists. The fishery stock stuff was so well advanced. This is the NEFROP stuff that we thought, well, those guys are doing a great job there. Let's leave them to it. Identification, training, public outreach. We thought, yes, that's a good general purpose. We won't focus on that for now. The R&D purposes for a lot of scientific research, far too variable to try to standardize initially. So park those for now. Human activities, we thought, to merge with the general full seabed characterization on the end. And so, yeah, pretty much out of all of those, our main focus ended up with the full seabed characterization. And there were many combinations of potential recommendations made under that one. We went back to the drawing board and fleshed those out. And this is just a summary of those three that we ended up with. One for feature verification, one for habitat mapping, and one for species and habitat monitoring. And if you think back to some of our responses in the surveys, these actually fit the bill quite nicely of what people are using imagery for, and the measures that people record information, the measures that people use to record information from their imagery. So the verification is more just sort of checking, verifying that things are on the seabed, verifying they are what they are. The mapping collects a bit more information, and then the monitoring is a different purpose again, collecting slightly more information again, more focused on trend spotting going forward. So just wrapping this up, our key messages here are that the high priority tasks from the Benthic imagery action plan that we picked focused on identifying the main purposes and standards we could use for Benthic imagery use. Members of the big picture group were then consulted about this project, and through means of the questionnaire and survey and interviews, we were able to find out a wide use of different uses of Benthic imagery. We then analyzed that, and through reviews and analysis, we ended up with sort of three purposes that are worth going forward with. And finally, we can make purposes and standards in this group for anything that we want, and they can all be sort of put into the same structure, like arrows in a quiver, I guess, and they can all slot into what our next speakers are going to talk about, is that the quality assurance framework for Benthic imagery. So that's an overview of how we sort of tackled that and got to develop some Benthic imagery purposes.
Great.
And just hand back over to Joey then.
Yep, thanks very much, Henk. That's really useful overview. So I'll open it up to see if anyone has any questions for you on the purposes work. So you can either raise a hand if you want to come in and ask a question, or use the chat. I guess yeah. So we have a question from Barbara asking, what was your rate of responsiveness for the questionnaires?
Thanks, Barbara. In doing this work for about 2 years now, I'm finding it's round about 40%. 40% seems to be our average. It obviously goes up and down depending on how free people are or how involved they are in that work. But on average, we're getting about 40% hit 40% responsiveness rate. I'm not sure how that compares to other studies or, you know, like other pieces of work, but there you go.
Great. Thanks, Henk. I'm not seeing anything else at the moment, but while people are kind of getting their questions together. Oh, no. Neil Golding, what happens to the 4 purposes that were decided not to be progressed for various reasons? Just a watching brief, or have you plans to do anything further with those?
Good question. Good question, Neil. They can be further developed. Absolutely. I think why we didn't develop them at the time any further is we needed something to progress the project onto the next level, which is the development of a quality assurance framework to actually test and assess data against those purposes. And those other purposes that didn't make the cut, I guess they could be further worked up and developed in time. It's just a question of resources, I would say.
Thanks, Henk. That would be quite a nice segue into the next talk, but I want to ask a follow-up on that. Do you think there's anything that's been learned by the more focused purpose work in these 3 areas that could be fed back in more widely? So either to the purposes that Neil's asked about that weren't progressed, or just imagery collection more widely. And is there a mechanism in place for doing that, for letting people know, you know, other than this workshop and the report, letting people know what work's been done in this area?
Yeah. We can figure out a mechanism. You know, currently the mechanism we've got, which the other speakers will talk about in a moment, is through the quality assurance framework work, and there'll be methods to feed in information into that piece of work, and to create sort of a review, new information coming in, going back into it, and enriching it. But outside of that, with regards to any other purposes, really, I think probably follow contact to the big picture group email with sort of ideas and anything going forward. And really, it can sort of get as big as we want, really. That's just my knee-jerk approach. If anyone else has any other ideas for anything that would work slightly better than an email to an email address, then please do pop it in the chat.
Okay, great. Thanks, Henk. I guess looking at time, we'll move on to our next speaker.
Okay.
So next up is, I think, a double act, Jess Taylor and Graeme Duncan. I think, Jess, you're going first, but I'll introduce you both. So Jess is a marine evidence advisor at JNCC, who's working on marine survey planning. And for the last year, Jess has been leading the quality assurance framework and Epiphone identification protocol work as part of the big picture. Graeme is a marine evidence manager, also at JNCC, and works on quality checking, storage and dissemination of Benthic data, and providing technical data engineering oversight to our marine teams. And he's also co-chair of the Medin Standards Working Group. And Jess and Graeme will be talking about the development of the quality assurance framework and also the Epiphone identification protocol. So over to you, Jess.
Brilliant. So I'm going to be talking alongside Graeme today about the development of the quality assurance framework that we've been building at JNCC for the last year, as fitting in with part of the big picture work that Henk has neatly just described. So hopefully this all links together and makes vague sense to people today. So linking it back to the Benthic imagery action plan, as Henk has described already today, this was pulled together a while ago, and the purposes work built on what we knew about in terms of people's aims and objectives for their survey collection and data collection that they were pulling together. And to do this piece of work, we wanted to build on what we already had in terms of the purposes and turn them into something that we could actually produce a standardized approach against. So that was linking in with the guidelines and other sections of the big picture work, which hopefully the purposes and the standards for them would be able to link into and feed into different areas of the action plan, as well as it just being useful for ticking off sections that already exist. Sorry, it's going to fly around. So the idea for this particular piece of work was to build on the purposes that we'd already identified in the previous year. And they were to develop standards for the purposes that the 3 key purposes that had been identified as part of the questionnaire and the interviews that were held the year before. So this was targeted at the feature verification, the habitat mapping, and the habitat feature monitoring that we were looking, you've just seen with Henk. And the idea was to create a quality assurance scheme for those three standards that fit in within that approach to basically improve standardization across different collections of imagery data, and also enable it to be shared more effectively between different organizations and different people working in different areas, with the imagery meeting certain qualifications, which mean that it could be used more availably across a wider group of people. To help this along, we also wanted to develop tools that we can help to standardize that data, but also to check whether your data meets with the standards that we've talked about, and also whether to flag any problems or any areas that need to be checked within your data sets to make sure it's compatible with others. So the process of this was built upon those 3 imagery purposes, with the first one being feature verification, which the main purpose of this within the work that we did was to identify if something is present in an area that you're looking at, its presence or absence of a target habitat or species. And we built a decision tree for that approach to decide between the 3 standards which ones you were aiming for, and then worked on the MEDIN standards that exist for the benthic epibiota data to create standardized proformas or data sheets that you can record your information into once you've analysed it, to be able to submit that more widely for external checking if you wanted to do an external quality assurance, but also to ensure it's consistent across different data sets. And this is what the feature verification proforma looks like. So we created these proformas for all of the standards that we had. So we also created one for the habitat mapping, which is looking at segmentation mostly of video imagery to identify where broad-scale habitats or different habitats delineated within an area, alongside still imagery, which had a slightly different layout with slightly more sheets and slightly more fields in it. And then we also created a habitat species monitoring proforma, which was the most complex of all of the proformas because it has the most information in it, and it also contained the matrices for abundance and percentage cover data and SAC4 data. So this data these were all pulled together as part of trying to create a quality assurance framework, meeting with this middle section of the quality assurance framework by using that proforma standard to fill in your data, to then be able to check that data to make sure that it's met with that standard, and then sign it off at the end of the process. We focus mainly on the middle section of this piece of work, so focusing on building the proformas and then also building the checks that you can do alongside them, which Graeme is going to chat to you about in more detail about shortly. The proforma data checks that we then planned on doing, so the idea is you select your proforma, you fill it in with your data, and you can then run these checks on it to assess whether the form has been filled in and whether the data's in the right formatting. And it checks presence and absence of data within fields that are mandatory by MEDIN. It also checks whether the fields are completed within expected constraints, which basically means, does it meet with what it should be in that field? Have you put a negative depth reading in, or have you put a time in a date column and a date in a time column? It would flag that as part of the process. It would also flag if there's any missing areas where there should be information that's not. And it also runs the Epiphone identification protocol on that data, which I'll talk about more a little bit later on the detail of how that particular process works. But going back to the actual proformas themselves, the color coding within them is linked to the MEDIN mandatory or conditional fields. So you only have to populate the things that are mandatory, and everything else is deemed extra or supplementary. So you don't have to populate that, but you can if you have that data available to you. So it's the main aim is to try and get all of that MEDIN mandatory data populated so that it can be archived later with MEDIN or used to share data more evenly, because you know that that data has all of the mandatory fields that you need. Alongside that, we produced 3 tools for this. We have the Quality Assurance Online tool, which does those checks for you automatically, and Graeme will talk to you in a lot more detail about that shortly and run you through an online tool so you can actually see the tool in action. But again, it completes data completeness checks. It does a species ID comparison with image quality, which again, I'll talk about a bit later with the EIP. And it also does a comparison. There's a comparison tool which looks at 2 different spreadsheets of data and compares if there's anything that's different between them. So if you have data that has different abundance records, if you've done a quality assurance and the quality assurance has come out with a different value for your abundance of that specific species, it will flag that so you can see it. Leading on to Graeme to talk about the tool.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Jess. So yeah, I'm just going to give you a short demonstration of the quality assurance framework set of tools as they stand. So these tools are currently sort of being developed as a proof of concept of what can be done in terms of automated processing and validation of the data. So with that in mind, bear in mind that in terms of how it looks, that's not the point of this. We're sort of trialing functionality and getting it to sort of do the job that it's meant to do. So this tool here is being developed by Marine Biological Association under their dash hat. So which is the data archive for species and seabed habitats, and they've obviously got a very good pedigree for data validation with their work under Medin. And the idea behind these tools is, as Jess says, for a bit of self-validation, to be able to just pore over a set of records correctly and come back with a set of suggestions of things that might not be correct. And the tools are being developed in a way that should make them configurable, not by yourselves, but behind the scenes. And what that means is, as I said, these are sort of pilot sort of first releases. So as tests, as people are testing it, and as more sort of ideas come through of things, changes in different the way it's behaving in constraints on different fields, the idea would be that it can be adapted to meet different constraints, and that it also can be adapted to different proformas as and when they appear. So the idea behind the workflow here is that you have your proforma that you've filled in as Jess has shown, with all the fields set up. What you would do is you simply choose a file. These are a couple of dummy proformas that I have already. Choose the file and then select the proforma type that the file is representing. So this is a stills monitoring proforma. And then you submit that. And this is where Jess said, see it in action. It is in action. It's just said text at the bottom there. Like I say, this is just doing things rather than showing them nicely. And what it will do is behind the scenes, it will churn through all of the fields, check that the mandatory ones are filled in, check that they're within sort of like feasible constraints. As Jess said, like depths are above 0. If there's certain fields that need to come from a vocabulary list, so they can only be a set of certain things, it will check that they are within those set lists. So it's gone through the checks. It's found 46 errors in the proforma, and the outputs are created in a CSV. And the outputs currently look like this. And the idea behind this is that it gives you, this is sort of the basic option, gives you a place where you can start an audit trail of everything that's been picked up. Because certainly in the early days, but even moving forward, computers are very quick and very clever, but they're very naive. They will do exactly as you tell them. So obviously the validation scripts will say that this is wrong. As we know, the world of marine imagery is a lot more nuanced than that, and it may well not actually be wrong, and it could be a completely valid exception to the rules. But the output of the check will come out with a sheet by sheet, field by field, row by row idea of anything that's missing. So you can see here that there's a set of mandatory fields that are completely not filled in the pro forma. So it's picked them up. These are fields that you need to fill in as per the criteria that Jess and the QAF group have set. There's a few fields that should have vocabularies, and the value that is in the particular cell is not the value that's in the vocabulary. So you can see here the value is showing error in percent composition. So obviously something's gone wrong in the calculation, and actually it's looking for one of these values. So it's suggesting what the value should be at the end. Similarly, visual quality of sample, someone's put satisfactory as per the version of the QAF that we have at the moment. That's not one of the allowable terms. There's a number field, which isn't a number. So you can see it's just going through various checks, very sort of simple in terms of understandable checks on the data, and just reporting that back on a piece by piece basis. And the idea being that you can then add a few fields to this to create your own audit trail to say, is this actually correct? Yes, no, what it was changed to, and that gets your keeps track of all the changes that have been made. As Jess says as well, it's also doing taxa checks against the Epifauna identification protocol. So you can see here actually that someone's put in the taxon name wrong, and using the worms, it is actually suggesting what the taxa instead should be. And similarly with the Katami class is put in a slightly different form that it should be, and it's suggesting what the Katami class should be relevant to that taxa. And then the main thing that it's pulling from the Epifauna identification protocol as well is actually using the logic that's been set by the EIP group to have a look at both the image quality and the taxa identifier, taxonomic identifier against the image, and see if the two match up. So as you can see here, for this particular instance, in the matrix, someone has identified this taxa here, and the image quality is satisfactory, but in actual fact, the EIP guidance says that you cannot identify this taxa at a satisfactory image level. In effect, you should define it as GoBID-A. So that's the first part of the tool. I don't know if it's probably worthwhile splitting questions per tool, if anyone has any questions now. I can't see Teams, so Joey, just say yes or no.
So yeah, I'm just waiting.
Yep.
I'm not seeing anything come up on the talk, and I'm not seeing any hands up.
Okay.
So I think you're good to continue.
Yep. Sure. And then so the second part of this is obviously as part of quality control standards or processes that you may have within your organization, or as part of NMBA QC. Often there will be a reanalysis of a subset of the samples or the images that you have captured within the survey. So you might, for example, reanalyze 10% of the images with a different laboratory to see if there's, for quality control, see if there's any differences, and just to get an average bit of some analysis off the top. So this is what the second tool that's been developed does. So it will look at what is in effect your main pro forma. So this is the one containing every single sample in it. This is my Google Chrome being very slow. Must be running out of space on my machine. And this is the subset pro forma. So this has a few less images, but it's the same images using the same reference identifiers for the images. And again, once you've done that, you can submit that. It will churn through the two and do a comparison of them. I'm going to do a here's one I made earlier whilst it generates the full results. And what that will return to, it will tell you if there are any errors in the actual or differences in the spreadsheet. And it will return two things currently. So one of them is just a summary document, which it summarizes differences per field between the two spreadsheets. So you can see in the stills analysis form, there's one difference, and the average difference between the two is 27. And there's a difference in the visual quality of the sample. Obviously, it's not a numerical field, so it can't give the average difference. And we also have some abundance differences between taxa in here as well. It also gives the average difference in terms of percent. The reason behind this is that sometimes absolute values don't give you the sense of error or possible error or sense of scale of the differences. For example, if you've got one person saying there's 1,000 of a taxa and one person saying there's 1,002 of the taxa, that's a difference of 2, but really it's a much less dramatic situation than if someone says there's 1 of this taxa in the image and someone else has said there's 3. So that's a summary document. That's just there as an overview of the of everything that's in the image. But really, again, the more useful one from an audit perspective is the individual differences. And so again, what this will do is tell you, in effect, per record in the spreadsheet, per column or per thing to be matched, the location of the difference. This is giving you the precise location by row and column in the original. And in the subset, it's telling you the 2 values, original and subset values. So you can see in this first one, the image offset in seconds, it's 3 seconds in the original and 30 seconds in the subset dataset or the quality control dataset. And again, it's giving you the difference, absolute and percentage. It's got your difference in your visual quality of sample. One says it's satisfactory, one says it's good for this particular case. And you've got some other differences in terms of your abundance that's in there. So you've got a difference of about 10 there and a difference of 2 here between your quality control. And finally, you've got a spelling error that is picked up, which is spelling error is in the quality control data set, and it can detect that the 2 things are different. The way that this matches up the 2 sheets when you're looking at your, what is in effect a matrix between your different taxa down your y-axis and your different samples across your x-axis, it uses the identifiers in both cases. So it shouldn't matter what order your taxa are in your 2 spreadsheets, or your in effect your images are in your 2 spreadsheets, as long as the identifiers are the same in both. Okay, that's a bit of an overview of the comparison tool. I'll wait again just for any quick questions.
Thanks, Graeme. I'll just see if anything comes in on the chat, or if anyone wants to raise their hands. Oh, we've got 2 hands up. Jen Durden.
So what's the intended use of the dataset comparison tool? Is that to compare between, like, say, 2 consecutive time points of survey at the same site, or 2 annotators looking at the same pictures? Or I guess it can't really be used for the former, because you might find totally different animals there, in which case you can't compare a particular entry versus the other. But it doesn't seem suited really to comparing the annotators, in that you probably don't care about whether they've counted 1,000 or 1,002 of the same thing, but more whether it's ecologically significant, the difference between what they've counted.
Yes, indeed. So it is very much, it's very much the second one as a, I suppose, an initial flag check. So these are checks that happen as standard generally, but undertaken unfortunately by people like Jess, who in the usual case of taking JNCC as an example here, we would have one lab analyze 1,000 images, for example, and then we would quality control and send maybe 100 of those images to a second annotator or second lab to reanalyze them. To check
I suppose
just,
though,
yep.
You might so this doesn't include like the important aspects of things like sample units or anything like that, which you would want to consider if you were comparing different labs, because it doesn't matter whether they have each individual the same, more matters what the answer is. And so how might you expand this to include aggregation into appropriate sample units? Because usually individual-based comparison isn't really that important.
Yeah, so you're talking about truncation really of your taxa into your sort of aggregated classes.
No, I'm meaning seabed areas of photos. So aggregate 10, 20, 50, 100 pictures together into a representative sample unit of the seabed.
Sure. I mean, I suppose one option is currently you could actually do that prior to analysis. You get at the same time you're just talking about a sample, so you could actually aggregate and do a sum of your different samples and put them through to that level. But yes, I mean that's definitely one use case that could be added on as part of this tool. So one of the sort of the points behind this is that it's a sort of very much a proof of concept as a sort of a foundation to build on top of, and to add on, you know, all the different use cases that can that will crop up as and when people use it. So yes, that's definitely a very valid sort of additional bit of functionality that could be added in terms of aggregation.
Potentially something to talk about in connection with the what do they call it, a quantification working group now?
Yes, yeah, indeed.
Okay, thanks, Jen. I guess Graeme, just to follow up on that, so this is more of your quick win, quick checks on the spreadsheets, kind of almost taking the low hanging fruit that can be done at the click of a button before or after you would do the, I guess, more ecologically meaningful checks. So that sort of.
Indeed, yeah. It's for picking out generally. So, like I said at the beginning, computers are the naive and stupid. You know, if it's either wrong or it's not. But what this is quite useful for, well, in terms of sort of replicating the human behaviors as well as it were that we do inside the lab, is if one analyst has said there's one thing of an image, or in fact if your original has said there's 1,000 of an image of a particular taxa in an image, and the next person has said there's 10. That is very likely a data entry issue that would otherwise be missed potentially by a human person if they're having to cycle through this many images, and can be just used as you said, an initial flag that you can then look through and identify whether it is a true error or issue or not.
Great, thank you. Henk had his hand up next. If you want to come in here, Henk.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. Yes, it's more just a follow on from Jen's comment. Really interesting comment that I think as this project has sort of developed and been scoped out, it has seemed like there have been so many other possibilities for extensions and growth that can happen with this. And I'm thinking, sort of going forward, it would be really interesting to start to capture a lot more of these kind of add-ons and going forward. So well, with reference to the discussion between Graeme and Jen, currently this just runs off of a single image. Every row in the data spreadsheets that go into this, every row is just a single image. Now, I'm not sure how everyone does their image analysis, but where an image is not large enough, like physically, spatially large enough to be a sample unit, it needs to be sort of grouped together with other images. Or if it's a video, it needs to be like a long bit of video, and it generally is much larger. You sort of need to sample areas, 5 square meters, 10 square meters, all depending on what your target taxa are. But this initial stage just looks at the image by image, but grouping images together into sample units, that's a really cool additional area for expansion. And there's a mess in there with how do you do that? How do you get appropriate sample sizes? And thankfully there are tasks and people interested in that, including Jen, who I know is very interested in that and has a lot of good ideas. So sort of going forward, it would be really really important, I think, to try and capture these future potential things and if people like this initial first go at trying to sort of tidy up kind of the first rung on the ladder of imagery standards just for certain purposes, if we all like that, then we can sort of grow it as time goes on, but we need the ideas to feed into it in order to grow it. Thank you.
And I just add to that, Henk, and say that we have been going back to the steering group that we currently have for the quality assurance framework at all stages so far on this process. So with the pro formas that we've created, with the proposed approach, and with the tool. So it's something that is in a testing phase. It's been produced relatively quickly, and it's also something that definitely isn't a finalized product. It's to be built on and improved over time. It's not there yet, but it's just a starting point.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jess and Henk and Graeme. Jen, did you want to come back in there?
I guess the other question I had was, how are you connecting these to the annotation platforms? Because you don't really need to make a new pro forma for Excel when they've already generated theirs. You could get those more popular platforms to maybe amend their outputs to produce what you need. And also some of those already have dataset comparison tools in them. So it would be cool to not reinvent the wheel and connect up with some of those ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable point, and something that we have considered as part of the quality assurance framework is how we link in best with the different imagery platforms that people are using. I think different people are using different platforms, so we don't want to be going with completely one platform, which may detrimentally impact others who are using a different platform. And we are looking at incorporating fields within the proformas that would fill in some of those gaps, such as label tree annotations or additional things. And as a future development, definitely to look at potentially creating standardized label trees or things that we could incorporate in, which would feed into the EIP work, is something we could look at as a future development, or linking in with an output and creating an automated way of producing that output into the standards that we have is definitely something I think that everybody would be really useful to do.
And just coming off the back of that as well, I think, Jen, like you say, with these, your online annotation tools, they have their own comparison and QC tools within them. And, this here is just a tool, in my mind anyway, is a tool that is there to provide the functionality of doing a bit of quality control on data sets should they be in, an Excel format. So, the question of whether the quality control inside the application, as it were, is suitable, to pass whatever rigors of there are for the NMBA QC or similar. I think that's a really valid question, and it's a question of governance. You can actually say, if you've done it in, software X and it's passed the validation test, you don't need to run it in this because you've already done it. That's completely feasible and completely sensible. So there's sort of questions on, like you say, sort of keeping this as an option if you haven't got those answers for annotation softwares, but allowing sort of not restricting people to using a single sort of tool to do the job.
I think it's also worth mentioning that there's some metadata that isn't captured in a lot of the online tools as well for annotation that needs checking too. So there's not always, not everything's held within the annotation metadata and things for images. There's extra stuff that gets captured as well that's not left anywhere.
Great, thanks, Jess. I saw Jen use your hand up and then down again. So do come in if you like. I see Dan Lear's commented that it also moves back towards med compliance for the outputs. So that's quite important too. I saw Neil had a question that Graeme has answered, and I think that's all okay as well.
I have a couple more slides, Joey, to go back to.
Yeah, great.
Just with regards to what the next steps are for this.
Perfect. Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Back to you, Jess.
Can you see that now? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So just to kind of finalize on what Graeme's been chatting about and what we've mentioned already, the outputs of this project are going to be incorporated into the NMBAQC Epibiota component in terms of where they're going to be saved and available for people to use. So they are going to be made available at the end of March for people to test and have a play with and see if it suits their data to do that. And we really welcome any feedback on that. We'll also be producing guidance documents on how to use the proformas and also the tools to make sure that people can understand, how to effectively use them and make sure that functionality isn't hopefully a problem in the actual running of the data in terms of what's been put into them. And the in addition to that, the next steps will be to get things finalized by the end of March. So the hope is to get the online tools, the guidance document and the proformas all finalized by then and out for anyone to input and kind of comment on their on any of the stuff that we've produced, and to give us their feedback on whether they think it's appropriate for them, whether they think there's something that's being missed, whether they think that we need to change things slightly or add things to them. And I think it's hopefully that will provide people with a chance to really feed in, and I would really encourage anybody who's interested to get in touch with us through the Big Picture email address, and we can make sure that you've got access to the documents and things to comment on them at that time. And that's it from me, if there's any final questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Jess and Graeme. I not seeing anything right now, so I'll sneak in a question while people are thinking. What happens after March? To either of you?
So after March, the plan is that this particular process will be made available for comment and people to look at it. And then in the future, if there is a standard that currently doesn't exist within the QOF, there's potential to incorporate that, or potential to incorporate changes and amendments to the approach, and to basically test it out and see how we get on, and if there's things that we can be doing to improve it, and hopefully move towards getting it to a more robust stage than it currently is with more reviews.
And certainly from the sort of online tool perspective, the idea post-March is that we're at almost a public beta, as it were, stage at the moment, and we'll be collecting user stories, changes and requests, and starting to build sort of on top of the foundation.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm not seeing anything else coming in, so I'll try and ask another tricky question. I know, because I've been a bit involved in this work, there's a huge amount of work has gone into it, and it's great to see the outputs coming together. Is it very difficult to use? So it seems like quite a lot of information in the performers and all of that. I know there is a gap there. That's why these have been produced. But is it easy will it be easy for people to navigate their way through the performers if they start using them for their work?
I think that it will be. I think that there should be enough guidance in place, and each field within all of the proformas has a description as to what that field needs to have in it to be populated, and how it needs to, whether it needs to be formatted in a specific way with time, or if there's a specific order for dates as well, whether that has to be done in a certain entry style. That's all covered alongside a rationale behind, a reasoning behind what needs to be put into each field. So they should be relatively straightforward to do. And the guidance documents alongside the readmes within the proformas and the guidance in terms of the diagrams and things should also be made available, and people can use those. So hopefully that will make it easier to use. And I would imagine there'll be stuff that's confusing and stuff that, you know, we use different terminology to other people. So there'll be things that people get mixed up on, but that's where the email address and where we're more than happy to answer those questions and be available if there is that kind of, you know, if there's any comments to come back on that. And in reference to what Charles just put in the chat, the Proformas tools and guidance will all be available on the NMBAQC website or the JNCC website as well. I think we'll have a link to it. But we'll be able to share that on the big picture group after that's live, if that's something that would be useful to people.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And Henk says Neil has his hand up or headed up. Do you want to come in, Neil?
Could be a legacy hand.
I think
Okay.
it's, yeah, I think it's, I can't see Neil's hand up.
Okay.
Henk has his hand up.
Yeah.
Henk?
Okay, great, thanks. It's maybe a legacy hand or a software glitch. Maybe it's only on my computer as well. So sorry, everyone. Yeah, just following on from Charlie's question and our answer so far. The plan for this is that it all goes live on the NMBAQC website from April onwards, and from then on in, if you want to participate in the framework, you can, warts and all. So, you know, the team and all of the steering group that have worked on this for the last 6 months, they've put everything into getting something over the line that does the job. But the nuance in the application of it will have to be sort of fleshed out as the months go on beyond April. So yeah, from April onwards, please do check it out if it's something you're interested in using to sort of tighten up the standard of your individual images, not sort of grouping images in samples and so on. Then yeah, it'll be good to go. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Henk. I'm not seeing any other questions or hands, so I think we have, yeah, I think now is probably a good time to move on to the last section of this session. So back over to Jess to talk to us about the EIP, Epiphone Identification Protocol.
So this is kind of the second piece of work that goes hand in hand with the quality assurance framework that we've just spoken about, which is the Epiphone Identification Protocol. And this was a piece of work that's been built on the idea of trying to some degree, standardize how people call certain things in imagery. So the problem that we currently have is that you can have one person calling something one species or one genus, and another person calling it identifying the same thing as something different, just because of their different level of taxonomy that they think that species could be identified to or taken down to. So the idea of the Epiphone Identification Protocol is to try and help with that. And it's built upon linking back to the Benthic Imagery Action Plan. It's built upon, is part of the tasks 37 and 40 to try and build on how to identify things effectively. And it's linked into multiple different sections of the Benthic Imagery Action Plan, as the quality assurance framework is, and it's also linked in with the quality assurance framework work that we talked about a minute ago. The purpose of the Epiphone Identification Protocol is to, currently we have a list of around 800 taxa within it, and the idea was to update those to meet current taxonomic levels within worms and make sure that the classifications were all up to date, and then to assign taxonomic recommendations for different imagery and video quality levels for each individual entry within that spreadsheet, so each taxonomic identification within there. And we also, as part of this work initially, after consulting with the scoping group, the steering group decided to reassess the image quality levels that we currently have and assess whether they were fit for purpose for the EIP, and whether there needed to be any more clarification or any more kind of detail added to some of the NMBAQC guidelines that exist for image quality to make sure that it was really clear what we were talking about when we were referring to different quality levels of imagery and video data. So that kind of came first, really, in terms of this work. And we looked at a revision of the NMBAQC video quality in a workshop that we had back in November time with a group of people from the big picture. We looked at people bringing different images with them and video segments to kind of understand what we meant by the terms of excellent, good, poor, very poor, or zero imagery quality. And we focused in mainly on the good and poor categories to kind of clarify in more detail, because people felt that excellent quality was a little bit clearer to understand as that really high level, super detailed imagery that you can get that it's really, really high resolution. Whereas what we would classify as poor or good is something that was a little bit more in need of clarification. We also agreed in this workshop to change actually the categories in terms of their names from good to satisfactory. So we swapped good to a satisfactory classification as we felt that more aptly suited that level of data. And it's also worth noting as well that for the purposes of this work, we decided in that workshop that actually very poor and zero quality imagery should not be used for taxonomic identification on the majority. There may be individual species or fauna that you could actually identify in very poor imagery quality, but that would be an exception, not the rule. And so we determined that those two categories would be left out of the EIP going forward. And also, if there is a situation where we'd be adding in another category, it would obviously exponentially increase the amount of taxonomic classifications we would need to do, because the more categories we had in, the more time it would take to assign categories for each species. How we then went on to the next stage of the work was to complete species identification workshops. So these were focused on specific taxa groups, and we completed 6 3-hour workshops for different groups within the time period from pretty much December to a couple of weeks ago. And these groups were collections of people from that EIP steering group and the big picture. And we basically joined together and talked about how we should be identifying species based on imagery of different quality levels and video of different quality levels, and what we should be effectively calling that species in poor quality imagery or in good quality, satisfactory quality imagery. And for each of those, we came up with a recommendation. So from the EIP, for each category and each species, we also looked at excellent, satisfactory and poor quality imagery and came up with a recommendation for them. We also reviewed the Katami classifications that we had within the EIP spreadsheet, looking at whether they were effective, and in some cases even highlighting areas where we actually felt the Katami classification wasn't the most appropriate for UK waters with certain taxa groups. And that's been taken forward as a future recommendation. But we also looked at fitting things into classification groups and seeing that it was applicable and the most appropriate classification for that particular species. We also, within those taxa groups, we looked at sponges, bryozoans, cnidarians, mollusks, arthropods, echinoderms, chordata, annelids, and a small number of platyhelminths that were within our spreadsheet. Now, the list of taxa that we had within the EIP were based off of mainly shallow water species, not massively any deep water species, and mainly focused on that kind of area of kind of less than 200 meters depth. And the reason that was the case was just because of the list that already existed. But we were aware of that from the start and aware that we want to incorporate more deep sea species going forward. The Eip protocol looks like this. It's a spreadsheet which has different sections to it. The first section is worms, taxonomic identification, which was updated with the AFIO ID and the correct taxonomic classification as of when I updated it, which will be redone again before finalising the spreadsheet just before the end of March. We also looked at morphological classifications. So we had a Katami classification, and we then looked at image quality. So we had an entry for each image quality category that we'd assigned. We also, in some cases, it was felt that actually the Katami classifications would be more appropriate for the species rather than taxonomy. And that was the entry that was put in rather than a traditional taxonomic classification, though on the whole, traditional taxonomy was retained throughout. Alongside the EIP spreadsheet, which will be made available. We also produced an EIP standalone tool, the most appropriate classification for that